Greetings, and welcome to day 2 of the 2025 National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Our theme for this year's NISAW is Enhancing North American Biosecurity to Protect Against Invasive Species. My name is Christy Trifone-Millhouse, the Executive Director here at the North American Invasive Species Management Association, also known as NISAW. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. We're really excited to have so many folks joining us today. Share with us in the chat where you're joining from. Also, after our presentation today, we should have time for some Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. If you add them to the chat, we will not be able to answer them. Also, after our presentation, please feel free to use the reaction button to let our presenter know that you enjoyed today's topic. NISAW is an international event powered by NISAW to raise awareness about invasive species, the threat they pose, and what can be done to prevent their spread. NISAW provides a platform for individuals from local, state, federal, tribal agencies, regional organizations, private industry, and citizens to discuss legislation, policies, resources, and improvements that can be made with elected officials and decision makers. This is a week not only for learning, but for action. Throughout the week, we'll be sharing links with you in an effort to connect you with your U.S. senators and House representatives. We want them to hear our collective voices and to learn about the importance of this work and why we need support and funding to continue to move forward. For those who want to take a more active role this week, please head to NISAW.org and find the NISAW Toolkit filled with template social posts, press releases, PSAs, and more. If you aren't currently connected to us on social media, please join us and share our daily posts. We have quite a week planned for NISAW with presentations focusing on theme of enhancing biosecurity at all levels. Our talks yesterday from Dr. Dia Lawrence and our partners at NOAA laid the foundation for our theme this week and highlighted primary and secondary introduction pathway management and biosecurity issues in marine and Great Lakes environments. We encourage you to visit our website to register for these webinars. And if you're unable to attend live, we will be posting these presentations to our YouTube channel after the event. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our agenda has changed quite a bit over the last month and is continuing to change even this week. I'd like to take a moment to thank those federal employees who have invested their energy and heart into this work. Some are no longer leading those efforts at the national level, while others are still holding strong. NISAW is driven by education and action. And as a partner, we recognize that now is not the time for us to take a step back and sit down, but rather as partners to stand up and move forward. And I encourage you to activate your networks behind our call to action and to provide support to programs and projects that need a bit of glue right now in any way that you can. Through partnership and collaboration, we are stronger. And this is truly the essence of our work here at NISAW. As leaders of NISAW is deeply vested in our mission to empower the management of invasive species across North America. We are led by an 18-member board of leading experts and professionals with supporting committees, which I encourage you to consider joining, a strong NISAW team, and a membership that continues to grow in numbers by the day. NISAW continues to be one of our far-reaching events with over 2.9 million people participating in last year's event. And we'd like to expand our connections even further. So head to those social networks and share, post, and like. Here at NISAW, we provide the connections, the tools, and the voice you need to address invasive species. We frame our programs around these 3 core pillars: We work hard to provide opportunities for collaboration and connection through our webinars, summits, and our annual conference. We equip our membership and those in the invasive species community with tools needed to manage and educate the public. And finally, we strive to provide a collective voice on a national platform to advocate for relevance and support through our government relations programming and events like NISAW. Speaking of events, some of our upcoming events you won't want to miss include the 2025 National Forum on Biological Control in Annapolis, Maryland, from April 14th through the 17th. The meeting themes revolve around biocontrol research, management, and impacts in natural areas. We've got some great speakers lined up, so I encourage you to register today if you're interested in networking in person with members of the biocontrol community. Another event you won't want to miss is the 2025 NISAW Annual Conference. Mark your calendar and plan to join us in Lake Tahoe from November 3rd through the 6th. Our theme this year is charting the new course. We've got some great speakers, some awesome keynotes lined up, and I really hope to see you there. Last year, we had close to 500 in attendance. So this experience continues to grow. And we would really love for you to join us. Head to NISAW.org to register today. As a friendly reminder, your NISAW membership dues help to make our mission come to life. If you're not currently a member, we offer a variety of different membership options. You can view our new membership structure on our website. Want to sponsor NISAW in a bigger and better way? Our new Premier Partner program is designed just for that. Premier Partners enjoy benefits throughout the year, including acknowledgement on our website, at events, and more. Again, head to our website to check out these options. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank our current 2025 NISAW Premier Partners, whose generosity made NISAW and many other NISAW events possible. Okay, now time for the main event. I'd like to introduce NISAW's Government Relations Manager, Mara Cunningham, who will be moderating our webinar today. Mara?
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Christy said, I am Mara Cunningham. I am NISAW's Government Relations Manager. I'll be helping moderate this session, which is titled Natural Security is National Security, Invasive Species and Their Insidious Impacts to Critical Infrastructure. And we'll be hearing from Matthew Kuhn, who is a veterinary medical officer with the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Health Security. For everyone watching, if you have questions, please be sure to put them in the Q&A box and we will answer them at the end of this session. Matt, if you would like to take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here and speak to everybody today a little bit on the risks to national security from invasive species. As Mara said, my name is Matt Kuhn. I'm a veterinarian and immunologist by training. I work for DHS. We really focus on invasive species from the national security perspective. So a little bit of what we're going to go over today, briefly touch on learning objectives, really talk about invasive species, how they fit into the DHS mission, look at some of the impacts of invasive species on critical infrastructure, and go through a few case studies of those impacts. And finally, we'll wrap up again with what we learned. So for learning objectives, it's pretty simple. We understand that the legitimate threat that invasive species present to critical infrastructure and thus to national security, kind of understanding those connections between the two, even if they might appear disparate at first. Then understanding the 9 critical infrastructure sectors that are impacted, that cost funding money, employee time, a reduction in resilience and readiness from invasive species. And then understanding the work that DHS is doing to shift our perspective on invasive species, to understand both their direct impacts on national security and the need to address them offensively rather than defensively from an all hazards approach. So starting off just with a brief quote, Aquatic invasive species are destroying the environment, damaging fisheries, and costing American taxpayers billions of dollars annually. This quote's specific to aquatic invasive species, but I bring it up because it's from a former Secretary of the Army, and it's about 2 decades old now. So I think it's really telling that this is not obviously a new issue. We knew back then that this was a discussion in the billions of dollars annually. And as we move forward and look at today's costs, we can see that they're only rising. Since 1980, we've seen a steady rise around the 2005 era. We saw a precipitous climb. And now the costs that we face from invasive species are really second only to storm damage. They've overcome floods, earthquakes, drought, wildfire, etc. This data ended in 2020. Wildfire data may be a little different now because we've also seen that. But we're going to get into that a little bit and explain why wildfire data might be involved with invasive species as well. So globally, the numbers are huge: 37,000 alien species with 423 billion annually in global economic costs. In the U.S., we look at estimates more around the 25, 26 billion annually in costs, which is still an extremely large number. From our perspective, a lot of those costs are to the critical infrastructure of the U.S. And so if we look at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, the DHS component tasked with securing our nation's critical infrastructure, there are 16 sectors. 9 of those sectors are directly impacted by invasive species. So we focus on critical infrastructure because they're the assets, systems, and networks of which are considered to be vital to the U.S. that incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on national security, national economic security, or the national public health. So that's the technical definition. More layman's terms, it's the pieces of our lives that we can't do without, that are essential to keeping our nation running smoothly. And so just kind of briefly running through these, on the food and agriculture side, which is what we focus on, we'll get into a little bit more. Pests are really the biggest damaging threat that we see, not only economically, but also threatening our nation's food security. For emergency services, the fuel that makes a lot of wildfires really either grow or burn more severely comes from invasive grasses, which can also make fighting these wildfires really challenging. Kind of less thought about is how invasive species impact nuclear reactors, materials, and waste. Invasive mussels, they can really clog up a lot of the water intake systems that are necessary to cool these systems. So that requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of downtime. Same thing with water, wastewater, and dams. I saw on the opening slide from NISAW, there's a picture of a dam there. That's another huge issue of invasive mussels is how they're clogging up dams and other waterways. Our defense industrial base is impacted by invasive species. Here we see issues both in the water with invasive corals, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but also with things like rats and other invasives on military bases that cause problems. Healthcare and public health is talked about consistently. Generally speaking, it's from vectors, things like mosquitoes and ticks. They're going to spread undesirable pathogens to us. But also, we have a lot of bites and stings that come from pests that we'd rather not have, as well as things like smoke inhalation, the knock-on effects of those wildfires that are increasing. Finally, we have government services and facilities, transportation systems. These are areas where invasive species, invasive plants primarily, are going to increase necessary maintenance, change how we build our infrastructure and facilities, and just generally cost more money to maintain. Digging in a little bit to what my office at DHS does, we really focus on health, food, and agriculture space, specifically looking at health security and food security as an integral piece of national security. So our mission is to lead and strategically integrate multidisciplinary and cross-sector partnerships that strengthen health, food, and agriculture security through innovative capacity building and solution development. Again, it's a lot of words to say. We sit in the center of these multidisciplinary groups and try to identify all the different folks that are necessary to bring together to really start to move conversations forward and address complicated questions. Some of you may have seen this invasion curve before. This is something we harp on consistently as using as kind of the driver of a lot of what we do. Many times when we are addressing invasive species, we're looking to the right of this. To the right, we're seeing the time when invasive species are established, they're widespread. It's a time when the control costs have somewhat moved away from addressing the management of the invasive species, and we're now facing the true damage from the invasive species as the economic cost or the vulnerability cost. Towards the left, where we want to be, is where we can see the costs are reduced. The square box is there, the cost. And so as the areas are smaller, there's less spread, we have reduced costs. And so our primary goal is to really move this whole shift, or move our whole scope to the left, essentially getting to the point where the arrow is, moving towards a semblance of early detection and rapid response. Not only finding what's come in quickly, but also having the people, the ideas, the funding in place of how to quickly respond to those threats once they've entered our country. So we do this primarily through expanding collaborations, have that collective impact. We have to understand first the costs that are going to come from invasive species. You'll see a lot of economic numbers today because that's an easy one to talk about. But a less discussed cost is the vulnerability to our nation. So you think about food security. If we start to lose major portions of our food production because of invasive species, that really puts our nation at risk from a national security standpoint. Same thing if a lot of nuclear reactors are starting to go under more and more maintenance and downtime. That's an issue for power generation. When we look at the defense industrial base, more downtime of facilities and equipment means less readiness from that perspective as well. So we try to understand what the costs are from invasive species for that immediate economic cost, also the secondary and tertiary effects, as well as those vulnerability costs. We take all that and we really try to use it to raise awareness about what's happening and bring that national security lens to this conversation. One focus we've had is island security, is national security. Islands are particularly vulnerable to invasive species given their generally isolated environments, as well as limited resilience to environmental changes. One of the important opportunities that the islands give us, though, because of that, is that they can be a bellwether, or a canary in the coal mine, if you will, for invasive species impacts. Because there's not as many confounding variables on the damages that the invasive species can cause in these islands, we can get a really good idea of exactly what kind of damage and costs very specific invasives may cause if they were to come to the mainland. So that can be a very telling data point for us. There's also a lot of national security implications that come from these islands. Many of them have military bases on them. Generally speaking, the economies of these islands are a little bit more fragile and less resilient, and so we can see a lot more economic harm come to them. So it's been a place that we've started to have more conversations with the local governments there, our federal partners that might be there, and other non-governmental organizations to understand how we can best support some of these islands to be resilient. Kind of just building on this, $14.9 billion from the economic cost of biological invasions on just the U.S. Pacific Islands. It's a huge number. And as you can see on the right-hand side there, globally, the economic cost of invasions increases fourfold every decade, which is quite the compounding number when you think about that over the last few decades. So one of the ways we do this is to take a multi-layered defense in-depth approach, really focusing again on this early detection and rapid response desire. And so again, I'll come back to that slide in just a second here, but moving back to our invasion curve, really shifting our focus towards the biosecurity, towards where that arrow is. And, first taking the tack of if we can keep it out of the country, then we don't have to address it. And understanding that our ports of entry are our primary defense against many invasive species, but also recognizing that they're imperfect. There are always going to be gaps. There are going to be ways that invasives get in. So we can't just count on that port or that border as the end all be all of keeping invasive species out. And so understanding and accepting that, to have those early detection systems in place, ready to go, to not only then detect what's come in, but also having the pieces for rapid response ready to quickly respond, quickly eradicate or contain is essential. Essentially, the way we do this is that we need to take an all hazards approach. These invasive species are affecting everyone. There's no one entity that's in charge. There's no one entity that could handle all of this. And so we take a focus on bringing in as many partners as we can to address this. you'll see in the upper right there is the Integrated Consortium of Laboratory Networks. This is a group that is run out of our office. Essentially, it is a network of laboratory networks. So it's made of the DoD Lab Network, CDC's Lab Response Network, USDA's National Animal Health Lab Network, and National Plant Diagnostic Network, which you see here, NPDN. Also has FDA's Vet Lab Investigation and Response Network and EPA's Environmental Response Network. So through that, we can bring together a lot of different eyes, a lot of different lab equipment, a lot of different focus areas to essentially, since there's many types of invasive species, we can't have just one lab network trying to find them, try to identify them. It really takes that whole community approach. But then we also take it from the federal level and try to work with our state and local partners as well, try to work with NGOs, try to work with just as broad of cast of characters as we can, because everybody has their own benefit they bring to the game. And it really takes everybody to start to move the needle forward. So again, looking back at our critical infrastructure sectors where we focus, there are things that we can do for everything to help, or there are pain points for each of them that we can try to address to slow the spread of invasives. So food and agriculture, it really is primarily that interception and interdiction at our borders. So really supporting our customs and border protection colleagues to ensure that they can do their jobs to the best of their ability. They have the best targeting systems available, and they can find as many of those pests as possible. For emergency services, it's managing those invaded grasslands, minimizing the spread of non-native species, landscaping with native plants, and understanding where to plant those native plants, really trying to reduce that wildfire fuel as much as possible. When it comes to the water sectors, both to include nuclear reactors and the water and wastewater and dams, really putting in infrastructure updates, trying to incorporate UV light curtains or other ways to reduce infestation by mussels can be really effective. For defense industrial base, for them, it's both managing what invasive species are there, but also limiting the impacts that they may have on spread. Because the Department of Defense does move around equipment so much, there's a really strong relationship between DoD and many other federal partners to ensure that they're taking the best steps they can to ensure they're not bringing any invasive species onto their bases, but also not moving them anywhere else. And that's been largely successful. Healthcare and public health is really, again, working on the interception and interdiction of pests at the borders, really trying to reduce the number of disease vectors available. And then for government services and facilities, and transportation systems, building resilient infrastructure that is made to cope with the rise of certain invasives. Okay, so we'll dig into a few of the critical infrastructure sectors, kind of starting with an overview of the sector, and then we'll go into a couple case studies briefly for each to just highlight some of the invasives that we're most concerned about and trying to prioritize a little bit for focus. So when it comes to the food and agriculture sector, it's maybe the most broad when it comes to the type of invasive species that can impact food and ag. And we have pests to crops. Spotted lanternfly is a great example of that, and it's been on the rise lately. We have pests to livestock. We'll talk about New World screwworm in a little bit. Pests to the forests through the emerald ash borer and other species. A lot of times we see vectors with pathogens, so kind of the mixture of both. So Huanglongbing or citrus greening disease we'll touch on. Harmful fish, like lionfish, can really decimate certain fisheries populations out in the wild. And then plants. Wild grasses are not only an issue to the emergency services sector and wildfires, but they can be really unpalatable to livestock. So as they spread over certain prairies, that can reduce the efficiency of some of our grazing animals. So if we start with citrus greening, it's really put American citrus on the brink of financial collapse, especially in the Floridian citrus industry. So the 2008 production value of Florida citrus was 1.77 billion, and I chose that date because it was about an average date for Florida citrus, but it was after some of the more serious hurricanes that had come through in the early 2000s. And so if we look at that, and you can see on the orange line on the right, if you follow that down, the current state of the citrus industry is about 12% of what it once was, which is a pretty shocking decline if you think about it. To lose 88% of your industry it's amazing that they've been resilient enough to keep anything going at all. So it's commonly known as Huanglongbing, HLB. Citrus greening it's caused by a bacterium, but that bacterium is spread by the Asian citrus psyllid, which is also an invasive species. So one of the downsides is that it can take years to having a meaningful effect. So by the time you recognize that your plants are infected, it likely means that it's spread well beyond your orchard now. It's gone to your neighbors, it's spread around the area. And so there's not always a lot you can do to address it once you identify that you have it on your farm. So the impact on agriculture has been pretty significant. The spread over Florida has cost at least $7 billion since it started. That includes revenue losses for farmers, research funding to go in and addressing citrus greening, attempted treatment of orchards, and many other expenses. It's been a considerable number for a single invasive species. On top of that, it's cost over 8,000 jobs per year, which is a lot of lives that it's upended and forced them to go and find other careers. On the culture side of things, on food security side, generally speaking, we don't see oranges as a staple crop or something that's absolutely necessary to our way of life. But certainly, orange juice represents a key source of vitamin C to many Americans, and it has been fundamental in our American diet, especially in school-age children. We can import citrus from other countries, from other states, but it's more expensive, and so that cuts out a certain, it makes it harder for kids in school to get access there, or schools to get access to the orange juice. It makes it more expensive and less likely that folks are going to buy that, and so it makes it harder to obtain that vitamin and have a well-rounded diet for many folks that might not otherwise have a lot of access to vitamin C. So to address citrus greening, there's some options, but not a lot. It's rather unmitigated at this time. If you remember from the graph, go back very briefly, you can see in California that it has been somewhat maintained, even though it remains a challenge for California of controlling it. Largely, this is due to early detection and rapid response from California agriculture, taking it very seriously to understand exactly where the spread exists, putting pretty significant quarantines on the areas around those, and essentially ripping out the trees that are infected and trying to ensure that it doesn't go any further. So that can be pretty significant steps to stop that transmission. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of other options. I have a bullet point here that citrus grove can be replanted with sterile stock. And certainly that's possible, but that assumes that all of your neighbors also don't have it, and that it's not in anywhere locally too close to you to come back on your farm. So it's not always a very realistic option for a lot of folks. Now, there has been some success lately with using wasps as biocontrol, a parasitoid that feeds exclusively on this psyllid that's harmless to humans. So we're starting to have some ideas of options we can use. Some in the early days of the outbreak just started using antibiotics injected into the trees. That seemed to slow the progression for some folks, but it wasn't a silver bullet by any means. And obviously that had questionable environmental effects as well. Also for food and agriculture, we'll touch on laurel wilt. So this is another invasive species that's a pathogen invasive working together in order to cause problems. So this one is caused by a fungus rather than a bacteria, and it's transmitted by the red bay ambrosia beetle. And there are some other beetles that can spread it as well, but not as successfully. So unlike citrus greening, the laurel wilt can kill a mature tree pretty quickly, only 4 to 12 weeks after infection, which does help to track its spread a little bit closer. For those that aren't familiar, because I was not when I first started learning about this, the laurel family of trees is pretty broad. So not only does it include avocados, but also cinnamon, sassafras, the trees that produce bay leaves, and camphor. And so it at least can be fairly clear when a tree is infected, at least in later stages of an infection. But again, we don't have an established cure. or anything necessarily that is again a treatment for it. So the impact on agriculture is similarly substantial. In southern Florida, we saw 140,000 commercial avocado trees destroyed by laurel wilt just since 2010. It's over 40 million in damages. A lot of avocado cultivars have been tested to see if they are susceptible or resilient to laurel wilt. And so far, nothing has shown great success or resilience. There's been a couple of recent studies out that have showed a couple cultivars of non-commercial trees that show some resistance, but nothing that has been translated yet into a replacement for current commercial growers. This comes at a really unopportune time, as avocados are really becoming one of the most traded tropical fruits. It's really a great opportunity for agricultural folks and farmers to develop a product that's in high demand. I think one of the biggest downsides also from laurel wilt is the impact it has on culture. So red bay trees produce bay leaves that are really important to cultural dishes. I just made a soup last week that had bay leaves in it. It's also something that's used by a lot of our native partners, used either as tea or burned for smoke. Sassafras trees are also infected. Again, outside my house, I have several, and they're one of my favorite trees to look at in the fall, turning a very, very bright gold yellow. And lastly, just as a little fun fact, the original recipe for root beer contains sassafras root, so it has deep American connections as well. Again, as most things we're going to talk about today, the best treatment is early detection and rapid response. Finding trees that are infected immediately, trying to prune those trees and those around them to increase light penetration and reduce the beetle activity in those areas, ripping out the infected trees, and importantly, cutting them into wood chips, burning them, or doing something else to stop the spread of the fungus and the beetle further. There are some fungicides that have some success, but again, resistance to any kind of antibiotic or fungicide is always right around the corner, so those can have limited impact. And again, similar to citrus greening, there has been a biocontrol agent proposed. I haven't seen large use yet, but it's at least the research is moving in that direction. We're seeing positive activity there. All right, moving back to the water sector. So nuclear reactors, the dam sector, and water and wastewater. Really, when we focus on this, we're looking at anything that uses fresh water in their systems. So nuclear power plants are using it in their cooling systems. Also, a lot of times in things like fire suppression systems. Hydropower and dams are using it for power generation, obviously. And a lot of our water and wastewater systems are using it for drinking water. So the one we're going to focus on today is zebra mussel. You can see on the right-hand side there that the red dots are zebra mussel, and they're by far the most widespread. In orange, you can also see the quagga mussel, primarily throughout the Great Lakes areas there, and a little bit in the Southwest. The squares are the areas where the zebra mussels have either failed or the quagga mussels have failed or been eradicated in the light squares. So it's pretty obvious that the areas of spread significantly outnumber the areas where it's been failed to be introduced or eradicated. So spread has been pretty significant, given it only arrived in the U.S. in about the 1980s, came from the Russia-Ukraine region of lakes there. It spread pretty quickly from the Great Lakes, where it's assumed that contaminated ship ballast water is released, and that released it into those lakes. Unfortunately, in the U.S., we don't have a lot of predators. Perch and walleye are somewhat good predators, and that's kind of about it. That really does a good job of keeping them at bay. And so because of that, they're allowed to thrive here in the U.S., whereas in their native ranges, they have a lot of predators, and so they're kept in control. Largely, we know that their spread is due to things like bilge water or water in a motor or live wells. And as those boats get moved between lakes, they take the zebra mussels and the larvae with them. The mussels can stick to the boats of hulls, can stick to fishing equipment, diving equipment, especially boat trailers. Boat trailers are a big one that water can get inside the trailer tubing. They can move it to, you can go fish another lake and release more water. Then also natural movement, but it can be fairly obvious if things move by natural movement or not. They can only move downstream by natural movement. And so you can tell the direction of identification of if it was natural or introduced. So the impact on critical infrastructure is a bit harder to quantify, but there are numbers out there from different time periods. One put out a nuclear plant, quantified it by understanding how much money they lost per day when they had to shut down to do maintenance. It is estimated they lost $1.5 to $2 million per day. And it's been estimated that plants that use water from zebra mussel infested waterways have to shut down about 4 times as often to do regular maintenance on their equipment as those that don't. So for a plant like this that loses almost $2 million a day, that can be a pretty significant cost to them. So that really the damage is coming directly, it can come directly from the mussels. The shells clog up pipes, filters, strainers, air conditioners, kind of everything. They get everywhere. And so that can be really challenging if anybody's ever picked up a rock with zebra mussels on it in a lake and tried to peel them off. They are very hard to get off. They stick extremely hard. It's no joke to try to keep them off of things. But they also cause a lot of indirect effects. So being mussels, one of the primary things they do in the environment is to clean up the water, which can be good for water visibility, but that can also allow certain types of algae to grow more than they naturally would. So for example, filamentous algae can grow in increasing amounts as you increase the number of zebra mussels in an environment. And then they themselves can clog up the cooling water intakes rather than zebra mussels. So you have compounding effects of what these mussels can do in waterways. So the costs then go beyond just cleaning. It also requires redesign of facilities to try to address and limit the damage that these can cause. Equipment has to be replaced faster. You reduce efficiency. And really, again, increase down for maintenance is a huge one. The other piece to this is the human health impact. So first, again, for anybody that's swam with in a lake with zebra mussels in bare feet, I'm sorry, it is one of the worst things in the world to have the paper cuts that they cause. On top of that, though, a very recent study came out that looked at the bioaccumulation of mercury in walleye and perch. And they found that the lakes that had a greater infestation of zebra mussels had more accumulation of mercury in walleye and perch. So we're starting to understand there are even more knock-on effects of these mussels to fishing and other food sources that we previously didn't really know about. And so over time, I think we're understanding the costs are greater and greater and come in different ways. So the name of the game is prevention with zebra mussels. Once they're established in a body of water, it is nearly impossible to get them out. It's only been done a few times. So the biggest thing is to empty all bilge or live wells, get water out of boats before moving on to any other body of water. When it comes to boat trailers, allowing them to really be cleaned after and dry for several days before entering a new body of water prevents that movement of the larvae. And then raising awareness. I think it's probably most fishers know about the threat that zebra mussels pose at this point, but having other folks, the divers, the other recreational sports enthusiasts, understand the risk that they pose by moving their equipment and what they can do to help prevent the movement is really important. And then finally, surveillance. Again, that early detection is essential. We do have several instances where environmental surveillance has picked up the potential for spread, either through something like eDNA or visual ID. And because of that really immediate detection, certain steps, such as you see below the chemical control at copper-based treatments, have been used. And in those cases, there has been some success because there's been low numbers, there was targeted treatment, and we've been able to keep mussels out of certain water bodies by really relying on that rapid detection surveillance. So again, copper control can be successful if it's very early on, if it's targeted. UV light treatment has shown some control for specific waterways or intake systems, more so use similar filtration when it's in conjunction with a specific facility, not necessarily trying to treat an entire body of water. So continuing to emergency services, again, primarily focused on invasive wild grasses here. The damage here is, so essentially the invasive grasses, and we'll go into this, are going to increase the amount of fuel available for wildfires, creating fires that grow faster, are more severe, and cause more damage. This puts more firefighters in more dangerous situations, increases the financial expenditure, not only from the federal government, but state governments, from people's pockets, and can have significant impacts on individuals' health, finances, and mental health. It's a lot of homes that we've lost over the past few years. It's a lot of cost to people. It's a lot of lives, physical and just amassed over time, lost. So we're not going to focus on a very specific grass today because there are so many and they're all many of them are similar. But there's over 350 that can pose a risk to the American West. The common ones that would get discussed are Mediterranean grass, buffalo grass, Kogan grass, Medusa head grass, and many others. What makes them such a risk to wildfires is that they have inherently lower moisture content than native grasses, and they also develop thick mats of dry litter on the ground below them. So they can burn hotter and faster. They increase the amount of fuel available. And then the downside of that's really bad is that they also grow faster and can recolonize a burned area faster than native vegetation. So what ends up happening is that we can have these vicious cycles of a forest fire comes through somewhere, wipes out much of the native vegetation, then that native vegetation is replaced by invasive grasses. These predispose that area to further burning, and then you create a cycle of more and more invasive grasses moving in while native grasses continue to be pushed out. And the impacts are huge. When we just look at the Lahaina fire in 2023, the cost was $4 to $6 billion economic damages. And invasive grasses did get called out in the first after-action report written of that wildfire as one of the primary fuel sources that they believe helped not only spark, but cause the fire to move so quickly. Now, the recent LA wildfires, while we're still trying to understand what the actual costs of that are ultimately going to be, early estimates here are in the hundreds of billions. So that's kind of setting a new standard for us of how we can understand the costs of these fires. In addition to just economic costs, also with 400 people have died in these fires since 2005. It's not an insignificant amount at all. And over 115,000 homes and structures. And then last but not least at all is the loss of indigenous and culturally important structures, sites, and artifacts. Lahaina especially lost a lot of the town and things that were really important to the native people there. So for prevention, there are steps we can take, focusing on planting native rather than ornamental grasses. Even us as normal people just out in the world living our lives, when we landscape our yards, making sure we're putting in native grasses, ones that are going to be more resilient to fire, putting them in the right places to create berms or fire breaks to reduce the chance of spread. After burns occur, we can go in and plant native grasses or spread agronomic seeds on top of that burn scar to try to help the scar develop the native grasses faster, grow those, keep the invasive grasses pushed out, or at least give the native grasses a head start there. And then we can use apps like Insight, which I think is what I use here, to look at where grasses are, to try to predict where they could go, and understand what kind of threat they pose to certain parts of the US and where vulnerabilities may be. One example is also from the Lahaina fire, going back to that, the third after-action report just came out this week. A couple of things they talked about for the vegetation prevention was increasing the production of seeds of native plants that could be available to those in Hawaii to replant and increase the amount of native grasses and just native plants in general, as well as to increase the use of livestock for grazing for control of the invasive grasses. So even now they're looking at ways of trying to reduce the the burden of invasive grasses there and prevent that fire cycle from starting again. Again, on the mitigation front, once invasive grasses are established in the area, it's really hard to do too much more than control. Elimination is generally going to be unlikely, especially with how quickly and how far they can spread. But there are ways that we can try to at least limit that spread. So limiting land disruptions. So that can be fire, that can be construction, anything that is going to turn over the soil and allow an invasive grass to come in more quickly than native grass. So again, overseeding those with native grasses immediately to try to give them a head start can be really important. Limiting the overgrazing of grasslands. Overgrazing can, again, allow those non-native grasses to overcome the native grasses, preventing that to prevent the non-native dominance and then breaking that annual fire cycle. So we're just going to very quickly touch on transportation systems because it is very similar to the emergency services sector. Really what we see here is two primary problems. One is that invasive grasses and plants grow very quickly. Because they grow so quickly, it can create the need for more maintenance, more mowing of highways, mowing around sightlines, just a lot more time spent in the field managing these plants. Then the other half of it is that a lot of the trees, things like Japanese knotweed, tree of heaven, have really strong roots and love to grow by roadways and railways. Because of this, their roots can destroy the embankments of railways. They can destroy roads. And again, we're increasing the cost of maintenance and replacement considerably by having these plants near our transportation systems. So then on to healthcare and public health. Similar to food and agriculture, there's a lot of different invasive species that have considerable impacts here. Again, vectors to disease are probably the most common that we think about, things like mosquitoes and ticks. There's also a lot of animals that can cause significant healthcare and public health threats, not only to humans, but to our lives or our animal companions. There's been stories of cane toads poisoning dogs that eat them. We know they're toxic. There's also the bite and sting of things like the invasive fire ants that are not fun for anybody. And then finally, a lot of invasive plants have been found to increase the severity of allergies because a lot of times we have not grown up with them. We're not used to them. So they can exacerbate things like asthma and severe allergies in a lot of folks. Additionally, they have knock-on effects, including the loss of biodiversity. They challenge the ability of ecosystems to pollinate themselves well, to filter water, prevent runoff, and to regulate the impacts of extreme weather events. And so because of this, because they're disrupting a lot of ecosystems, it has secondary, tertiary effects that can be difficult to measure, but are no less impactful. So for our case study here, we're looking at New World screwworm, which is top of mind for many folks right now. New World screwworm is a parasitic fly that really feeds on wounds of animals. So it says flesh here, but really they focus on when there's an active wound, or sometimes if it's a recently born animal, newborn, it can be on the navel or the mucous membranes. And so really these flies are laying eggs in that, that flesh, that exposed flesh. The larvae then hatch and feed on that flesh, that tissue, which can create more areas for eggs to be laid. And so if left untreated, it can be fatal to the animals. And we've seen in Central America in the last few weeks, there's been many animals that have succumbed to these infestations. It really does prefer a hot and humid environment. So down in Central America and South America has been where it's been for a number of years now, but it used to be in the U.S. and Central America. Thanks to a very successful eradication program in the 1990s, it was pushed down south of Central America down to Panama. And it stayed there until about early 2024, when it began to creep north again. It finally reached southern Mexico in late 2024 and has continued to start to show more signs of moving into Mexico. So the impact on humans, or the impact is really on humans and animals. It's not just us, it's our dogs, it's our cats, anything that might be outside that could be infected. It's especially true. The current outbreak has infected several people, especially those that work with livestock. They're at especially high risk. I'm not going to show any images of infection because they're quite graphic at times. And then also, it's not just about the initial infection that causes problems. As you can imagine, if you have larvae infesting a wound, it makes it harder to treat that wound. It invites secondary bacterial infections in. So it can cause a lot of complications that make it a much larger issue than just the initial infestation itself. The impact on agriculture can be pretty significant as well. USDA APHIS estimates that screwworm costs $20 million to the livestock industry each year. As it marches north, if it was to continue through Mexico, the couple of the first states it might meet is California and Texas, 2 of our top 5 dairy producing states. So that really puts them at risk, puts our dairy industry at pretty significant risk. It's not only the health of the animals, a lot of those animals that are infested, you can't use their skin for leather production because it causes so much damage. So there's a lot of, again, knock-on effects, secondary effects, cascading effects of these invasives. Luckily for screwworm, we do actually have some pretty good prevention methods. So the sterile insect technique was invented several decades ago and has been proven effective time after time after time. So this technique is where male flies of the screwworm fly are sterilized via radiation and then released into either infected areas or areas on the border of where the infection is, where we don't want the non-sterile flies to move. So these male flies that are sterile mate with the wild females. They obviously produce unfertilized eggs, which reduces the population over time. Right now, USDA is strongly collaborating with Mexico's Department of Agriculture to bolster their production of sterile flies. They've started releasing them throughout southern Mexico, creating a veritable wall, if you will, of sterile flies to try to stop that march north of the screwworm, and then, as it was done before, continue to push it south again, further and further down into and past Central America. Beyond the sterile fly method or the sterile insect technique, as we've talked about with agriculture as well, stopping things at the border is the most important means for preventing the invasive species from moving. So having appropriate animal checkpoints and import checkpoints between all the Central American countries, ensuring any animals that move have their certificate of veterinary inspection, have been appropriately treated, and are free from infestation. Okay, and our last case study and last focus area. So the defense industrial base. So I think I've so far mentioned one of the risks is to bases, things like rats, invasive mammals. They can cause havoc on bases. They can cause a lot of problems to storage of food, where people live, how they go about their daily lives. And it can be extremely challenging to control or eradicate such populations like this, and it's been attempted many times. Additionally, many pests can be vectors of disease that really, again, we talked about earlier, the resiliency factor. The last thing we need is disease near our military folks that are trying to defend our country, reducing their resilience, taking them out of the fight. And so the one we're going to talk about today is invasive octocoral, which has been an issue for a couple different parts of the country. So invasive octocorals are a type of invasive coral that outcompete native species. They reproduce very quickly. They can reproduce asexually. They consume a lot of the resources in an area, and they also have natural chemical warfare. So as they approach other corals, they release the chemicals and substances that kill those other corals around them, allowing them to spread further and faster. They also can reproduce just via fragments. And so once a fragment is released, it can attach almost anywhere, grow quite quickly. So primarily we know that spread has been through ballast water. There's also been challenges, especially in Hawaii, with illegal aquarium dumping. So folks having coral in their aquariums, they decide they don't want an aquarium anymore. And so they think, oh, well, this belongs in the ocean. Let's go dump it out there. That's caused some pretty significant issues. So the impact on the defense industrial base. So I would include this to be both Department of Defense and Coast Guard, which is under the Department of Homeland Security, is through things like the snowflake coral. It attaches primarily on inlet surfaces. And again, we get back to this maintenance piece. It increases a lot of maintenance, especially for things like harbors, not just ships, but just maintaining a harbor, maintaining equipment in a harbor. In January 2024, the U.S. Navy spent a considerable amount of time and money trying to get just a football field of octocoral out of Pearl Harbor, just a small amount. It was a short-term success, but ultimately we know it's going to come back. And again, it can be very challenging to keep this out for long periods of time. Beyond just the direct impacts on defense, it also is really just bad for reefs. These reefs that are a very delicate balance of the coral that's there, and the fish populations can get thrown out of balance. And then lastly, one of them is very well known for emitting a rotten fish odor that has, in cases, there are examples of where tourism has declined in certain areas specifically because of the odor of this coral. Again, prevention. Getting rid of ballast water well before a ship reaches harbor or freshwater is one of the best places or best ways to limit spread. We can treat ballast water with onboard filtering systems or just use sealed ballast tanks. Once it's in place, there are ways to manage it. As I mentioned, the Navy took considerable steps to try to remove it from Pearl Harbor. You can use tarps and sandbags to smother it. But the biggest thing is, as I mentioned, if it fragments, it can spread very quickly. So trying to remove it in a way that does not allow it to fragment or disperse further can be really challenging. Okay, so how is my office at DHS involved with all this? How do we get involved? How does it all come together? So the gray ellipses or gray ovals here are the areas where our office tries to enter and has active programs. So on the engagement and coordination front, I've hit on multiple times today the need for multidisciplinary teams, having folks from all the different areas that are impacted or could impact invasive species is essential to moving the needle forward. We do risk assessments. That includes looking at different threats, understanding our vulnerabilities, and doing risk analysis to understand where our gaps are. So again, this is not only trying to understand the economic costs and the economic risks from invasive species, but also getting into our understanding of how they impact general readiness, how not just from a defense perspective, but again, food security, how resilient are we from a food security perspective to different threats. We do exercises. So we're developing different exercise scenarios that can be used by our state and local partners that include invasive species and how they might impact different sectors, how you can build coalitions, how you can identify those other partners in your local or regional areas that you need to quickly respond to the identification of certain invasive species. Along the same lines, we're doing gap analysis and needs assessment, trying to understand where the holes are in our preparedness, trying to understand what information is needed, what physical equipment is needed, what laboratory understanding is needed to be able to rapidly identify intrusions and respond to them. So all this feeds down into products that are going trying to today to research and development, testing, evaluation, coming up with new. I think several of the case studies today we talked about didn't have a solution yet. So there's a significant amount of research that needs to be done still, not only to understand how detection occurs, but also then how to limit spread, how to control, how to eradicate. And finally, along those lines as well, innovation. How do we change what we've been doing to do better? In a lot of cases, what we've been doing for 2, 3, 4 decades hasn't been working. How do we come up with new strategies, new ideas, new partnerships that can try to attack these challenges in a different way and hopefully get some better success? So lastly, I'll just reiterate where we've kind of gone today. The invasive species are a legitimate threat to critical infrastructure and thus to national security. These 9 critical infrastructure sectors are impacted by not only the economic costs, the increased funding by federal, state, local, and non-governmental organizations to try to address them. It costs employee time, and it creates a reduction in resilience and readiness for our nation. DHS is working to shift our perspective on invasive species, really trying to move that lens to the left, getting to that point of introduction to really focus on the early detection and rapid response capabilities, having those systems in place, having the partnerships in place ahead of time, so that when there is a detection, we can quickly address it and focus on eradication rather than allowing it to move to management or control. And really trying to take that offensive approach rather than a defensive approach to all hazards mitigation of invasive species. So with that, I'll end.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Matt. We really appreciate your time and expertise on this topic. It looks like we have one question in the Q&A that I'll go ahead and rattle off if you'd like to answer. We have,
Sure.
how do zebra mussels increase bioaccumulation of mercury in walleye and perch?
So I'm not 100% sure, but my assumption, based on knowing that perch and walleye are predators and some of the better predators of zebra mussels, is that as the zebra mussels are filtering the water, that's how they get their food, is just to filter the water. They're filtering out mercury that's in the water, and it accumulates in the zebra mussels as they then become the food source of one of the primary food sources for perch and walleye in those lakes. That bioaccumulation goes up the food net or goes up the food chain and then further accumulates in the fish.
Thank you. And next we have, how is OHS engaged in the National Early Detection and Rapid Response Framework?
Yeah, so we are actively engaged with the National Invasive Species Council, working with them to one, enhance their view of invasive species as a national security issue, and again, this early detection framework, but also, for example, working with some of these island nations to bolster their security or biosecurity training, trying to move their focus earlier in the detection scheme, not only in theory, but physically with training systems, so that they can try to do a better job of focusing early, spending money early, and not having to respond as far down the road after establishment.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much again. If there's any further questions, we'll try to answer them offline. We are a little bit over time. I'm just going to go ahead and share really quickly with everyone our call to action for the day. We like to do this here at NISAW to close out each of our sessions, and we're asking you to contact your legislators to reintroduce RAWA, or the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. This act represents the most significant investment in wildlife conservation and invasive species management efforts in a generation. It would dedicate millions of dollars and open thousands of jobs to invasive species management and other vital wildlife conservation efforts. So we ask you to scan that QR code or click on the link in the chat, send a letter to your legislators. And last, we do have a full week coming up of more of these webinars. If you'd like details, you can see them at nisaw.org. We hope to see you at more of our presentations, and thank you all again for attending.